Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This podcast is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. Tim Shorrock joins us today, and in recent weeks there have been cries of alarm about North Korea's missile testing all throughout the media, but they've omitted some key developments like the massive military buildup in South Korea and Northeast Asia over the past few years. So Tim provides us with some of that omitted context, including the fact that the South Korean armed forces, allied with the U.S., is the 7th largest in the world. Tim grew up in Japan and Korea, and he's been covering national security and other topics around Asia and the Korean peninsula since the late 1970s. He's a correspondent at The Nation, and he's the author of the popular book Spies for Hire: The Secret World of Intelligence. We recorded this on December 31st, 2019. Tim Shorrock is here talking to us from Washington. Hello, Tim. Happy New Year, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
Happy New Year to you, and thank you.
So you've got a really good piece in The Nation just before Christmas, and it's particularly, I guess, good time to talk about this because, you know, the big fuss was that Kim was going to give us a Christmas present in a missile form or some other thing, and you chose to sort of provide a different view of what's going on in Asia, and the title of the post is called "A Low-Intensity War is Underway in Northeast Asia." And this is in The Nation, and this will be linked in the show notes for those who need to read it. So, you know, the hype was that Kim was going to, you know, launch an ICBM or some terrible missile, and Trump made some really kind of weird comments about how it might be a nice gift, it might be a vase, or I don't know, just some really bizarre things. Now, Christmas has come and gone. There's been no missile tests as far as I know. But I do see some things in the news about how Kim's going to do his New Year's speech and how, well, I'm just going to turn it over to you to set this up before we talk about what's happening today. So tell us about this, the buildup of what has actually been happening, no matter what the chatter and the talk has been. There's been a slow and steady buildup, and the fact that the INF treaty is no longer in place means that there seem to be some people who are really taking advantage of that. So it's an extremely dangerous situation. Plus the surveillance buildup, which you mentioned, which I didn't know about. So let me just get out of your way, Tim, and let you talk about this.
Well, first of all, the article is I wrote it to warn people about something I've been saying for years, which is that the United States is not an innocent bystander in Korea. The conflict with North Korea is presented by the media as basically, the United States is shockingly being threatened by North Korea. And it's the stories are completely out of context and never explain why North Korea built nuclear weapons in the first place, why they have developed missiles, long-range missiles, to hit the United States. And over the past couple of years, and especially the last 6 months or so, have been testing medium to short-range missiles that, to the alarm of U.S. analysts, who say these missiles could hit U.S. bases in South Korea and Japan. Well, North Korea sees itself as surrounded by this massive military force. The United States, its ally South Korea, which, as I point out, is one of the largest military powers in the world, spends far more than North Korea can spend, and also an alliance with Japan. And that means, three of the most powerful militaries are arrayed against North Korea. in alliance relationships, with the United States. And so when North Korea, since the beginning of its negotiations or talks with Trump and the Trump administration, have said that they want to have the U.S. hostile policy removed in a way to improve relations. That's one point. The North Koreans have been very, terrified, in fact, by the possibility of an attack of the United States and its allied forces on North Korea, to overthrow the regime, regime change kind of operation, and that's the main reason that they have built a deterrent force against that. And so, that's what these talks are all about: how to defuse the U.S. military confrontation with North Korea, and how to create some kind of peace regime in the Korean Peninsula to allow the two Koreas to improve their own relations and develop toward whatever they feel is right for their countries. And the conflict is always described, as I said, as the U.S. sort of being threatened for some strange unknown reason by the North Koreans. And so that whole context is never, hardly ever there in any kind of discussion in the U.S. media. And so, yes, over the last year, they have been testing, as I said, these short and mid-range missiles, but they've also been, had several, a couple. They had two meetings with Trump, and they've had these continuous negotiations with Pompeo and U.S. officials, led by Steve Biegun. And the last one, as we know, almost a year ago, in end of February, March in Hanoi, Trump, on the advice of Pompeo and Bolton, rejected the North Korean proposal to shut down a big chunk of its nuclear arms program at this site called Yongbyon, in return for some lifting of some of the sanctions imposed after its tests of missiles, long-range missiles, and a nuclear bomb in 2016 and 2017. And so when Trump rejected that, instead, wanted this grand deal, and where they would give up all of their weapons, their entire nuclear force, as well as other conventional weapons and chemical weapons, other kinds of weapons they had. And then they would, if they finally did that, then they would get a lifting of sanctions. And that's been the hardline U.S. position pretty much, for years. And after Hanoi, and that fell apart, Kim and his government began to warn that, unless they got a comprehensive proposal from the United States that would meet the terms that it seeks of improving U.S.-North Korean relations and creating a peace, working for a peace and a peace agreement in Korea, that they would find a new way to deal with the U.S. And so that new way was Kim Jong-un's, the leader of North Korea. That was his term. And, since he made those statements in the spring, there's been this, continuous guessing game in the U.S. of like what that new way may mean. And, they've signaled through some of the tests they've given and statements they've given that they're, ready to build a stronger military deterrent. And so you had, of course, all these, when they said there was going to be, they also said it was up to the U.S. to decide what its Christmas surprise would be, meaning the ball's in your court, Trump. And there has been no comprehensive response to the U.S., to those demands or requests. And so all we've seen is, this guessing game of, well, they're going to test. They're going to go back to long-range missile testing missiles that could hit the United States. They may even test a nuclear weapon and so on. But there's also other possibilities that they could do, and we shall hear within the next 24 hours when Kim Jong-un delivers a speech to this Workers' Party meeting that's going on right now over the New Year's. And his speech is always, he gives the same, kind of speech every year on New Year's, and that always signals the North Korean policy for that next year. And so nobody knows what he's going to say. Nobody knows what they're going to do. And obviously the predictions of, ICBM and nuclear tests on Christmas Day and beyond, have fizzled. There's been nothing. And some people have even, analysts who follow North Korea very closely are actually saying they're alarmed, but there's been basically silence from Pyongyang. So there's this, like guessing game, and it's kind of a dangerous game because it's scaring the American people. Like, a lot of people actually believe that North Korea has the capability to put a nuclear weapon on a rocket and shoot it at the U.S., which they do not have. That's what the negotiations are aimed at preventing. They do not have that capability now. So there's a lot of this reporting and media coverage of this is fear-driven. And you can see the fear in posts by ordinary Americans and, to news stories and to tweets about this. There's this, Kim's going to bomb us tomorrow and this kind of thing. And the reality of the situation is that there's this really, big, military buildup on both sides. North Korea does have advanced weapons. But of course, so does the U.S., so does South Korea. As I mentioned in that article, the South Korean Air Force put out a film of its ability that showed like a mock preemptive attack on North Korea's long-range missile facilities, showing the use of drones, showing high altitude reconnaissance drones, bombers, F-35s, advanced fighter jets. It's the arsenal at the South Korean command. Most of those weapons built by the U.S. And Japan too has been under Abe, the very conservative Japanese leader, has been building up its forces, building new kinds of weapons, what they call a small aircraft carrier, to project power and with the United States. And a lot of that is designed to project power against North Korea. So you do have this, this standoff going on. And the question is, how is that going to be resolved? So, it comes down to two things. One, it would be, if North Korea is not going to do any kind of preemptive attack on U.S. or U.S. forces, because a preemptive attack by North Korea would be suicide. They would be completely destroyed in a retaliatory strikes for days afterwards. That's just not going to happen. Second, the United States and its military have made clear they're not going to go to war to prevent North Korea from obtaining nuclear weapons. They already have, that decision has already been made. And North Korea has nuclear weapons. They have not gone to war to stop that, because people in the Pentagon know, people who have served in the U.S. military and know the history of the Korean War know how terribly destructive a war would be for North Korea, South Korea, the whole region. And so, the question is, how do you resolve this without it becoming a war? And I think that's the key question. And I think that reasonable proposals have come. Let's have a peace treaty to formally end the Korean War. That would mean that the state of war would be over, and there would be no need to have this massive military forces arrayed against each other. Have a peace agreement with step-by-step moves to de-escalate and demilitarize the situation.
Now, as far as the Christmas gift comment, we don't speak the language. I mean, you understand the language. You follow their media. what actually happened? What was actually said, and who said it?
Well, Kim Jong Un has said, talked about the new way. This Christmas surprise quote, came from one or two articles by high-ranking North Korean foreign ministry officials. There's the people that have been negotiating directly with Begin and Trump's team, and there's a few other figures that are well known to policy analysts who often write commentaries in North Korean state media. And I mean, like for example, after the meeting, the one meeting they held after Hanoi that involved Pompeo, the U.S. side. This was a meeting that was held in Sweden a few months ago, and it was presented by the U.S. side as like this is our attempt to really try to get beyond the earlier failure in Hanoi and to craft an agreement. They had a 1 hour meeting, and after it was over, the North Korean side came out and said the meeting was a waste of time. The U.S. has no intention of presenting new proposals, and they don't even know why they were there. And so then the U.S. had to scramble and say, well, actually, there was some good things about this meeting. But these statements have actually, the use of the term Christmas surprise has come from senior North Korean officials. And, they know how to play the media here. They've been doing it for years. All they have to do is, say something like that, and the media jumps. And then immediately there's endless speculation about what might happen. The important thing is to always, look for what they actually do say and what they actually do. And so far there's been no tests, no launching of anything unusual, and so it's all it's like I've been saying, it's just like in this big guessing game. But those,
Right.
they're very clear that they do not want to continue this path if the U.S. just keeps saying, promising, nirvana after they denuclearize. We're going to help you develop your coastal cities and et cetera, et cetera. This kind of dream of Trump to, build some kind of, new kind of facilities on their coast and bring in tourism and so on. They want to have real proposals to defuse the situation, and that would allow the strangling of sanctions to be lifted. I mean, that's a big part of this. And so I think that, I haven't been making predictions because I think it's dangerous to actually make predictions and say this is going to happen on a certain day. But I've seen signs that, Kim may announce a new way of trying to shift the situation away from the confrontation with the U.S. He may, announce, new kind of relationship with China and Russia, which are both on record recently as seeking an end to some of the more onerous sanctions that have been imposed, and probably would not vote for added sanctions if they did something that the UN and the US considered provocative, like launching an ICBM again or something. I think the support for sanctions, tightening sanctions, may no longer be there in the UN Security Council, and so they may lean toward developing closer economic ties and political ties with both China and Russia. That's a possibility. They may launch a satellite, which they've always justified as being part of their civilian needs to have satellites in space to monitor whatever satellites monitor, like the weather and crops and so on. And the last time they did that during the Obama administration, that sparked another crisis because Obama and his people saw it as an act of testing long range missiles. I mean, there's a lot of things that could happen. So, I just don't predict there, but I think it's important to actually, when a new policy comes out, to really analyze it and really look at the words and what they're actually saying.
Right. Yeah, I think that's wise. And the elephant in the room is Russia and China. The the other elephant in the room, I think is still the case, is that South Korea itself is against this buildup, this steady buildup. And actually, no matter what we say, North Korea is going to watch what we're doing, which has been a steady buildup of our military in South Korea. Some of the surveillance missions that you mentioned in detail, I recommend people read through all the things that Tim has laid out. He gets into exactly, which equipment, which missions, which, flying over the Korean Peninsula. So it's kind of like no matter what Trump says or Pompeo says, they can see what we're actually doing. And then the other sort of quiet buildup, which you also mentioned, is what's happening in Japan. And I don't hear much mention of that here at all in relation to North Korea. But we also have this steady shift of um, influence between a lessening influence and trust in the United States, and more influence and trust in Russia and China. And their strategic alliance just seems to keep growing stronger. And I mean, they're both of those countries are on the border of North Korea too. So it's their region.
Right.
So it seems to me that, and again, I have no business predicting anything, but it just seems logical to me that, and this is also, I should mention, there's a lot of talk, sort of a lot of chatter, both from the Russians and the Chinese, that it's stupid to make a deal with the United States because you can't trust the United States. They won't keep their word. And I didn't hear that just once. I hear that coming from a lot of different places.
Right.
So a shift toward the relations with Russia and China by the North Koreans seems logical. But even with all of that, they've still got this massive threat, just over the border, on their peninsula, not far away. These places are the distances are not great. So it just kind of boils down to the declining empire being a dangerous creature. And I even wonder whether they are going to give up on trying to get sanctions relief, or if there's going to be just ways of subverting, or better, more, let's say, official ways of making these sanctions not as impactful, like alternate financial systems and things like that. So that's just like the sense of it that I have from a not well informed specifically, but kind of well informed in a broader sense of what's going on in the region. I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
Well, first of all, I'll address some of the things you mentioned. First of all, South Korea's military, as I said, is very powerful. Yes, they have been under Moon Jae-in, who sort of instigated all this diplomacy to begin with about 2 years ago, during the Olympics that happened in South Korea, the Winter Olympics. They've had this, they've been buying all kinds of advanced, U.S. weapons that are, many of them are offensive weapons, and aimed at destroying underground North Korean facilities, over above ground facilities, and they've been buying the most sophisticated U.S. aircraft, these F-35s, Global Hawk drones, surveillance drones, and North Korean side, like when South Korea first introduced the F-35s earlier this year, they saw that as an escalation, and it's a sign that while Moon has been very supportive of the peace process and wanted it to happen, his military is also very strong. And Moon Jae-in himself used to be in the special forces, South Korean special forces. All Korean men have to serve in the military, but he did, and he served, in special forces units, and he was part of he was in the special forces when there was almost a war between the U.S. and North Korea, when North Koreans killed two American soldiers in the DMZ that were cutting down a tree, and there was this major response by the U.S. and South Korean militaries. U.S. started flying B-52s, over Korean skies at the time. And the South Korean military, of course, controlled Korean society for 3 decades, and it's a very entrenched military bureaucracy there that cut its teeth, so to speak, on fighting North Korea.
Yeah.
And so like that's not to be forgotten. And it's still like while Moon controls his own military, they have a strong power base, and they're very much supported by conservative South Koreans and South Korean politicians. So that's one thing. I mean, South Korea has a very serious and powerful military, and so and the fear about this year. You're right. Like the U.S. media and these think tanks like CSIS just promoted this idea incessantly that while Trump and Kim are talking, North Korea is building up its capabilities, its weapons capabilities. Well, yes, they are, and so are we. There never was an agreement. There is no agreement to stop its nuclear program. It's just a general statement of principles, of which the two main points that they agreed to in Singapore was to develop improved U.S.-North Korean relations, build a new relationship, and 2, work with North Korea and South Korea to support the peace process. Those were the first 2 points of the Singapore meeting. And after that, it was denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, by which North Korea has meant denuclearization of South Korea and the broad U.S. forces that are nuclear armed that are arrayed against North Korea. So they want to defuse the nuclear threat against themselves. There's American U.S. Navy ships that sail out of Japan and submarines that are based in the region that carry, nuclear weapons. And some of the planes that they fly over on a regular basis, like these B-52s, they flew between Korea and Japan a few days ago. Those can carry nuclear weapons, and the North Koreans know that. So, that buildup is well known by all the sides. And what's what CSIS never says. They'll say, oh, these missiles that they're testing are very dangerous to U.S. interests because they could hit our bases in Japan and Korea. Well, yes, they could, because that is the deterrence that North Korea needs to defend itself at this point without any kind of agreement. So that's why an agreement in negotiations is so critical, and why I think the idea that's been percolating for years, and especially popular in South Korea and North Korea, for a peace agreement to bring an end to the Korean War is so critical. And I think like that was forgotten in the negotiations that began in June of 2018 when Trump met Kim. The U.S. think tanks and so-called experts have been shooting down this idea of a peace treaty because they say that will be the way that somehow that Kim Jong-un gets the U.S. to withdraw its forces from South Korea, and that's the way Kim is going to take over South Korea. And the latest NDAA bill, the National Defense Bill that was passed by Congress, has language in it that prevents the U.S. from withdrawing its forces at all, and they cannot go below what's the number they use? I think it was 25,000. And, the U.S. ambassador to South Korea, gave this speech, this really arrogant speech where he said, U.S. troops are going to remain in South Korea no matter what the South Korea decides. He said it's an alliance decision, he said, but they're going to remain after peace or anything. It's like, if South Korea, as part of a peace deal, wants U.S. forces to leave, that's their right. But to U.S. hardliners, no, that's not their right. The U.S. is never going to withdraw its forces, and that kind of talk is dangerous and works against the whole idea of negotiations. And so that kind of hard line is just completely accepted here by the Democratic Party and liberals. It's like, oh, sure, we have to maintain our troops there, but like for a lot of Koreans in the South, that people do by majority has supported the military alliance with the U.S. They feel that South Korea, is better off with U.S. forces there. But when you ask about long term, and what would happen if there is a peace agreement, people will say, well, yeah, well then, it's at some point there will have to be the U.S. We won't need U.S. troops here because they're not needed to protect us against North Korea if there's peace. But for the U.S., its forces in South Korea are not just there, as a tripwire against any kind of war with North Korea, but they're there to project U.S. power,
Right.
as they've always been there for. In 2003, 2004, during the Iraq War, at this big base, near the DMZ called Camp Casey that I've written about, U.S. Army base. It's the closest U.S. base to North Korea. That's where the U.S. Army's 2nd Infantry Division was stationed for years. And in 2004, without any kind of advance notice to South Korea, and in about a day, the U.S. pulled about 2/3 of its troops that were there stationed on the DMZ from the 2nd Infantry Division and sent them to Iraq. And that was a shock to a lot of South Koreans who are like, wait a minute, I thought these troops were like essential to protect us from North Korea. And a lot of those troops never came back. Camp Casey, it's now mostly an artillery base. But that was the scene of one of the false alarms over the last 2 weeks. That instead of taps at the end of the day up at that base, someone in the base let out the siren that signals an imminent, North Korean attack. And for a few minutes, people thought a war was starting. And it just shows you how kind of trigger happy people are. This was just a few days after Christmas, and then it was one day after Christmas, after the so-called Christmas surprise. Well, one day into it, when NHK, the Japanese state TV network, put out this story that turned out within about 10 minutes to be a false story. They had to put up another post saying the story was wrong, but they put out a story that there was a North Korean missile test, and then as soon as this rumor was floated, your big experts, your technical experts that are often quoted by the Times and the Post, they were analyzing, what kind of missile it was and projecting that it was this or that. And then they immediately, as soon as the story was canceled, they all had to, delete their tweets and show how responsible they were. But these guys, they're just waiting for this kind of thing to drum up the militarism again. And the fact that there was 2 very serious false alarms, one from the Japan network and which is owned by the Japanese government, and the other one from the U.S. Army, just shows you this sort of how much this fear is gripping the military in both in Japan and Korea and in South Korea. So it's like, let's not fool anybody. This is a really dangerous situation, but there's got to be a way to negotiate it. And I think that's we will find out what their new position is soon. But the only thing to do is to respond with negotiations that respond to the concerns they have and have had historically about what they consider the hostile American policy.
Right. So, I mean, it does seem to, no matter what else happens, there just seems to be this underlying truth that South Korea is a permanent military base for the United States, and that has kind of always been. But now we have this added situation where the highest level, not only the think tanks and the analysts, but the military themselves, they've shifted. The most important threats are now, and are now the Russia and China
Right.
entities, but also in their language, you hear very little about the war on terror anymore, and it's all about great power competition,
Right.
which makes the prospect of ramping down or removing troops, American troops from South Korea, just less and less. The more that escalates, the chances just seem to go lower and lower that we're not going to continue to do, buildups of if not more troops, then more equipment. Um, and just, as I was mentioning before, the whole China and Russia, it's just becoming the underlying, um, you know, most important thing. And it's sort of like the North and South Korea peace between them, ending the war, just seems to like be sinking and becoming subordinate to those things. But the you kind of got into something that I wanted to ask you, um, like other than what I just mentioned, like why is South Korea so important to the military? Like, what do we actually do there? What are we just doing? Um, surveillance, and are we just doing protective measures, and are we just doing exercises? What are they actually doing? Because I've gotten little bits of things from someone. There's a whistleblower out there now, so called, and I'm not sure if it's a real whistleblower or not, but talking about things that were actually happening in South Korea. Is there anything you have any insights on, what our military is actually doing there?
Well, what they over the last 10 years or so, the U.S. military has been moving its forces. They've been consolidating its forces in a base about 50 miles south of Seoul. So they've moved a lot of the bases that were on the DMZ close to Seoul to this new base called Camp Humphreys, which is in a city called Pyeongtaek. And Camp Humphreys is now the largest U.S. military base in the world. A massive, massive complex. So the U.S. has, the U.S. has the U.S. Army there. The U.S. has, Air Force, major Air Force units there. There are special forces there. These troops, they like I said earlier, they can project, anywhere in the world. But it's 20, altogether it's 26,000 American troops are in South Korea, and then you have about 70,000 in Japan and Okinawa. And one of the things that's not known about U.S. forces in Japan is that they are many of them, the U.S. bases in Japan are part of the so-called UN Command Korea, which is, of course, commanded by a U.S. general. But the UN Command in Korea has something called UN Command Rear, which is the rear bases that would support the UN Command if there's another war on the Korean Peninsula. And the UN Command Rear is based at Yokota Air Base in Japan, which is the headquarters for the U.S. military in Japan. And it flies a UN flag because of that. And there's some bases in Okinawa that also fly the UN flag that are part of this rear. So they're integral to the U.S. Any kind of military U.S. response in Korea would always come through Japan. Japanese ports would be the ports of embarkation for vast military vessels, air bases obviously for planes, Okinawa for surveillance flights and bombers. And then of course there's Guam, which is not that far from there, where the B-52s and other nuclear, possibly nuclear armed planes that can carry nuclear arms are based. B-2s can fly in. I mean, so there's this, it's a huge and very powerful force that the U.S. has there. And the other thing that a lot of people in America don't know about is the fact that for years the U.S. South Korean Joint Command was commanded at all times by a U.S. general. Now it's commanded by a Korean general in times of peace, but still under times of war. If there's ever a war, the entire South Korean military would be under the command of a U.S. general. And
Tim, is that a war in Korea or a war anywhere in the region?
war in Korea.
Okay.
And when any war that South Korea was involved with, the U.S. would be in command of its military as part of this joint. And that control system is now being subject to negotiations between South Korea, because South Korea would like to get that command of its forces in wartime back.
Yeah, you think?
Korea. Yeah. But it shows you how much power the U.S. has. And so, like I said earlier, a lot of people in South Korea, they support, in theory, in general, the alliance with the United States. But like when it comes to like recently, Trump administration demanded that South Korea quintuple its payments for U.S. by 5 times its payments for U.S. forces in Korea. And like 90+% of South Koreans in recent polls said, no way, they're against that. So South Korean patience with the U.S. alliance is thin. And so they support the alliance in general, but when it comes to like paying, massive amounts more, no, they don't want to do that. And they also, when they're asked, if these troops should stay even after a peace agreement, then the percentage for that alliance goes down. What the U.S. does in decision making, has a huge influence there, and it could reduce the nuclear threat to North Korea if it chose to. It could remove nuclear weapons from certain ships that are there. There's steps it could take to address the concerns of the DPRK.
Right. But it's much more strategic than that. And that's another thing that the so-called the hawkish analysts don't seem to add into the equation. Hey, we're out of time, but I just want to mention that on a different topic. I was going to try to bring something up, but we didn't have enough time, so I'm going to try to follow up with you kind of soon, because your book on the privatization of the intelligence operations is a great book. I've got it here. I'm not finished yet, but I want to expedite my finishing of it, because I think it was always an important book, but I think it's going to become even more important again. There's the reports about the Operation Dread in the UAE and some other things that I think bring it up to the fore again. And I'm hoping that we can maybe chat about that in the not too distant future. I just wanted to mention that because
you're talking about Spies for Hire, which was published first in 2008 and then 2009, and I have not updated it. But especially in the area of cyber warfare, which is now focused. Huge amount of its U.S. efforts are focused on North Korea, right? Cyber is the most, as I pointed out in some articles, is the most privatized part of U.S. intelligence. That's already very privatized, and so you have all these private companies that are like, it's basically in a state of war with North Korea. And the other day on Twitter, I posted some ads I saw, for cyber intelligence analysts being recruited by Microsoft, ACOM, and a big defense contractor. So like,
it's a gold rush, Tim. It's always been a gold rush.
That's right. That's right. You say Korea, and like the military-industrial complex jumps up and down with joy because it keeps their coffers filled. The one last thing I want to say, Joanne, is that the effect of militarism is terrible in Japan and Korea. And anyone who's been following Okinawa know there's been this powerful movement against the expansion of U.S. Marine bases in Okinawa, which are there to intervene in Korea if that possibility comes up. And also that's where most of the U.S. spy and surveillance planes I described in that article fly out of. And there's been this struggle, this democratic struggle in Japan, in Okinawa, against these bases and their expansion, and that is being stifled by the Abe government and the U.S. government and the U.S. military. And that's a direct impact of militarism that's very sad. And that same thing is happening in South Korea on the island of Jeju, where there was South Korea built a naval base there against opposition of many people on that island. And then the U.S. said, "Oh, we're never going to use this base." But lo and behold, U.S. Cruisers have stopped there, and other warships, U.S. warships have come there, and it's part of the missile defense system against the DPRK and China now. And there's a new airport being built in Jeju, which is clearly being designed for military purposes. And so, people's rights are being trampled as all this happens. And that's really important for us as Americans who have any kind of say in our policy, should really keep in mind.
Right, and focus on that. And for people who want to, at the very least, improve the situation in Korea, I mean, where should we focus even if we're not activists, where should we focus our efforts on? At least ending the war? Is that a good thing to focus on and to bring up, repeatedly?
Absolutely. And there's going to be, in the spring, there's going to be a campaign by several U.S. peace organizations led by Women Cross DMZ, which has really brought this issue into the forefront. There's going to be a real focus on the importance of a peace treaty and a peace agreement. And and there's already a little bit of support of that by some progressive Democrats in Congress, and I think that's a really important thing to focus on. And even some senior Democrats on the Senate side have begun to see that is an important component of de-escalating the situation. So going from an armistice, which is just putting the guns down, to a peace agreement that's formalized that would have to involve China because they were also a party to it. It would involve, the U.S., North Korea, South Korea signed as a member of the UN command, and then China. All those countries, the three countries plus South Korea would have to sign that peace treaty. And I think that is something that would move the situation in ways that U.S. analysts just never imagined. And I think that's a very important focus for people here that are concerned about, war and don't want to have another Korean war.
Exactly. Okay. Thank you so much, Tim. Please, real quick, tell everybody where they can find your work and how they can best support you.
Well, you can look me up, especially at The Nation, Tim Shorrock, and then search The Nation. My authors page will come up with all my articles going way back, all the way. I think about 16 years worth of articles on The Nation site, and then follow my Twitter feed because at Timothy S, because I post a lot about Korea that never gets into articles.
Yeah, I follow it closely and buy his book. And I'm going to get him. I promise I'll bug him to come back to talk about that pretty soon because it's really important.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Tim Shorrock. Follow Tim on Twitter at Timothy S. Find his work at The Nation and at his website, timshorrock.com, and buy his book, Spies for Hire, The Secret World of Intelligence Outsourcing. Around the Empire podcast is independent media, and your support's really important. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. There are many ways to find and listen to the Around the Empire podcast. You can listen to it on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on any mobile podcast app, or on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Follow on Twitter @aroundtheempire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.